Meaning is not something the universe gives. It is something human beings demand. From the beginning of thought, people have searched the sky for answers. They believed the cosmos must contain a hidden order, a purpose written somewhere beyond human reach. Yet one philosopher looked directly at this hope and stripped it bare. Albert Camus did not begin with comfort. He began with confrontation. Before modern psychology spoke about existential anxiety, before the culture of 2025 openly discussed the crisis of meaning, Camus had already seen the fracture. The world does not answer the questions we ask of it. Human beings crave meaning with relentless intensity. The universe remains silent. This silence is not a minor philosophical puzzle. It is the central drama of human existence. Camus was not born into privilege or abstract speculation. His life began in poverty, under the harsh light of colonial Algeria and in the shadow of war. These experiences forced him to look at life without illusions. When others searched for comforting systems, he searched for honesty, and honesty revealed something unsettling. Human beings live inside routines, habits, and expectations. Then suddenly, one day, the routine cracks. A person wakes up and asks a dangerous question. Why am I doing all of this? That moment is not simple confusion. It is awakening. Camus called this awakening the encounter with the absurd. Not because life is meaningless in a trivial sense, but because the human hunger for meaning collides with a universe that refuses to explain itself. From this collision emerges one of the most radical questions in philosophy. If the universe offers no pre-written meaning, how should a human being live? Everything that follows in Camus' thought grows from this confrontation. His ideas about revolt, freedom, moral limits, solidarity, and creativity all begin with that single realization. And it is exactly this journey that the following chapters explore step by step. Meaning does not collapse suddenly. It erodes in silence. One morning, a human being wakes inside the machinery of his own life and something fractures. The alarm rings. The body moves. The coffee is poured. The street fills with the same faces moving toward the same obligations. Nothing has changed. Yet everything feels exposed. The rhythm that once felt natural now appears mechanical. Habit reveals its skeleton. And in that moment, a question rises with brutal clarity. Why am I doing all this? This is the moment Albert Camus forces us to confront. Long before the modern world wrapped emptiness inside endless entertainment, he saw the crack forming in the human experience. Born into poverty in colonial Algeria and shaped by war, illness, and political chaos, Camus did not begin with comfortable theories about meaning. He began with the naked condition of existence itself. A human mind that demands purpose, a universe that offers none. From that collision, he exposes a truth most people spend their lives avoiding. Life does not first appear meaningless in tragedy. It appears meaningless in routine. The absurd begins in repetition. A human being can endure suffering for a reason. War can be justified by ideals. Sacrifice can be justified by faith. Pain can be endured when it serves a future promise. But repetition without explanation slowly dismantles those illusions. Day follows day. Work follows work. Desire repeats itself. The structure continues. Yet the deeper question remains unanswered. Why this structure at all? Camus strips away the comforting lie that human beings always live consciously. Most of life unfolds under the hypnosis of habit. We wake, we work, we pursue small satisfactions. We construct plans for tomorrow. We move forward as if meaning is guaranteed, simply because life continues. The mind rarely stops long enough to interrogate the foundation beneath it. But eventually, the interruption arrives. Perhaps it is a moment of exhaustion on a crowded train. Perhaps it is the sudden realization that the same day has been lived 1,000 times before. Perhaps it is the quiet recognition that every effort leads toward the same destination called death. At that instant, consciousness sharpens. The routine does not disappear. The alarm still rings. The work still waits. But the illusion of necessity dissolves. The human being now stands outside his own life and observes it like a stranger. This is the awakening Camus calls the absurd. The absurd is not chaos. It is not madness. It is not simply despair. The absurd is the confrontation between two forces that cannot reconcile. On one side stands the human hunger for meaning, order, justice, explanation. On the other side stands a silent universe that refuses to answer those demands. The tension between these two realities creates the absurd condition. Camus insists on a brutal clarification here. The absurd does not live inside the universe alone, nor does it live inside the human mind alone. It is born precisely in their collision. Human consciousness demands a story. It wants the world to justify suffering. It wants existence to reveal a final purpose. Religions promise such meaning. Ideologies promise historical destiny. Even personal ambition promises significance. Yet, when the mind asks the deepest question, why does existence exist at all, the universe remains silent. That silence is not temporary. It is structural. The stars burn without intention. Nature unfolds without moral explanation. Death arrives without negotiation. The universe does not hate humanity. It simply does not respond. Camus demands that we stop pretending otherwise. Many philosophies attempt to escape this confrontation. They rush to insert meaning where none has been proven. They build systems that promise hidden purpose. Camus rejects this impulse as a form of intellectual surrender. To invent meaning simply to comfort ourselves is to refuse the courage of clear sight. The absurd begins precisely when illusion collapses. Consider the psychological violence of this recognition. A human being suddenly realizes that the structures guiding his life were never guaranteed by the universe itself. Career, reputation, social success, moral certainty, all of these exist inside human agreements rather than cosmic necessity. What once felt solid now feels strangely provisional. The mind experiences a strange distance from its own actions. A person walks through a familiar city street and suddenly feels as if he is watching himself from outside. The buildings remain the same. The language remains the same. Yet everything feels slightly unreal. The ordinary world loses its automatic authority. Camus describes this experience as estrangement. Not estrangement from society alone, but estrangement from existence itself. The human being recognizes that he is a conscious creature thrown into a world that never asked for him and never explains him. The ground beneath his assumptions disappears. Here, the absurd reveals its psychological power. Many people retreat immediately from this realization. They rush back into routine. They bury the question beneath distraction. They return to comfortable narratives that promise eventual meaning. Camus understands this reaction. The absurd is not pleasant. It strips the mind naked before the indifference of the cosmos. Yet he insists that this awakening is also a form of intellectual honesty. To see the absurd clearly is to refuse comforting lies. It is to confront existence without decorative illusions. This act requires a rare form of courage because the human mind instinctively seeks reassurance. It wants certainty. It wants a final explanation that justifies suffering and death. The absurd refuses to grant that explanation. But Camus makes a crucial distinction that many readers misunderstand. The absurd does not mean life is worthless. It means the universe does not supply ready-made meaning. That difference changes everything. When people first encounter the absurd, they often interpret it as pure nihilism. If the universe offers no meaning, then life must be empty. Camus rejects this conclusion with force. The absurd is not a conclusion about value. It is a diagnosis about the structure of reality. The universe does not provide meaning, but the human demand for meaning remains alive. The tension between those two facts creates the central drama of human existence. Camus illustrates this moment of awakening through an ordinary psychological scene. A worker repeats the same labor every day. At first, the routine feels natural. The structure of work organizes life and provides direction. Yet one morning, the worker suddenly asks a forbidden question. Why am I doing this? The question spreads like a crack across consciousness. Why wake up? Why work? Why pursue goals that dissolve with time? Why endure effort when death eventually erases every achievement? The mind begins to recognize the fragility of its previous certainties. Camus insists that this moment is not rare. It waits quietly inside every human life. Modern civilization often hides it beneath speed. Technology multiplies distractions. Social media floods the mind with stimulation. Endless information prevents deep reflection. Yet the underlying structure remains unchanged. Human beings still wake inside routines that promise meaning without ever proving it. In this sense, the absurd has not disappeared in the modern age. It has become more hidden. The contemporary individual moves faster than any generation before him. Yet, speed does not eliminate the fundamental question of existence. It only postpones it. The moment still arrives when the mind pauses long enough to ask what all this movement is actually for. Camus believed that the modern human condition intensifies this confrontation. As traditional religious structures weaken and absolute ideologies collapse, the individual stands increasingly alone before the silence of the universe. The comforting narratives that once explained suffering lose their authority. What remains is the raw encounter between consciousness and the world. At the psychological level, this encounter produces a strange mixture of anxiety and clarity. Anxiety emerges because the human being recognizes that no external authority guarantees meaning. But clarity emerges because the illusion of predetermined purpose dissolves. The mind begins to see its situation with ruthless precision. Camus believed that this clarity is the true beginning of philosophy, not abstract speculation, not academic debate. Philosophy begins when a human being confronts the question of existence without distraction. At that moment, another question inevitably appears. If life has no predetermined meaning, how should one live? The absurd awakening, therefore, does not end the philosophical journey. It ignites it. Once the illusion of automatic meaning collapses, the human being must decide how to respond to that revelation. Should he escape the absurd through denial? Should he abandon life entirely? Or should he confront the absurd directly and continue living with full awareness of its truth? Camus refuses to answer this question too quickly. First, the awakening must be fully understood. The absurd is not a theory invented by philosophers. It is an experience that emerges from the structure of consciousness itself. Whenever a thinking mind asks the universe for ultimate justification, the same silence answers. The human being now stands at the threshold of a deeper confrontation. He has seen through the illusion that meaning is automatically provided by the universe, yet he still carries within himself the burning desire for meaning. That tension cannot be erased. It can only be faced. And it is precisely within that unresolved tension that the next and far more dangerous question begins to take shape. The absurd is not merely a feeling, it is a structure. A human being demands meaning with relentless intensity. The universe answers with silence. Between these two forces, a fracture appears that no philosophy can easily repair. Albert Camus identifies this fracture as the central condition of human existence. The absurd is not an accident of history. It is the permanent tension between the mind that asks and the world that does not respond. And once this tension is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Camus arrives at this insight long before the contemporary world began celebrating confusion as freedom. Raised in poverty, witnessing violence and political collapse, he did not construct his philosophy from comfortable distance. He confronted life, stripped of its romantic illusions. In that confrontation, he discovered something that most systems of thought attempt to avoid. The human desire for meaning is infinite. The universe offers no guarantee that this desire will ever be satisfied. This is the birthplace of the absurd. The first force in this collision is the human hunger for meaning. Human consciousness does not tolerate randomness easily. The mind organizes reality through explanation. We build narratives that justify suffering. We create moral systems that promise justice. We imagine that every event must ultimately serve a purpose. Even tragedy becomes acceptable when it fits inside a story that leads somewhere. This psychological instinct runs deeper than culture or religion. It emerges from the structure of consciousness itself. To be aware is to seek coherence. The mind constantly asks why. Why do we suffer? Why do we work? Why do we exist? Why must everything eventually disappear? These questions are not philosophical luxuries. They are existential demands. A conscious being cannot avoid them forever. Even when buried beneath distraction, the questions remain alive beneath the surface. This hunger for meaning shapes entire civilizations. Religions promise divine purpose. Political ideologies promise historical destiny. Economic systems promise progress. Personal ambition promises fulfillment. Each system attempts to answer the same silent question that haunts human awareness. What is the point of living? For centuries, these systems offered powerful reassurance. The world appeared structured by divine intention. History appeared guided by moral direction. Human suffering appeared justified by a greater plan. Within these frameworks, the individual could endure hardship because existence seemed to possess a final explanation. Camus observes that this confidence has slowly eroded. The modern human being increasingly stands in a universe that offers no obvious narrative. Scientific discovery reveals a cosmos vast beyond comprehension and indifferent to human hopes. Political ideologies collapse under the weight of their own violence. Religious certainty fractures under modern doubt. What remains is the naked confrontation between consciousness and silence. The second force in the absurd emerges from this silence itself. The universe does not explain itself. Stars burn without moral intention. Galaxies expand without purpose. Natural disasters destroy without judgment. Death arrives without asking whether a life has fulfilled its potential. The structure of reality unfolds according to physical processes that do not care about human meaning. This indifference is not cruelty, it is absence. The universe simply does not answer the questions human beings desperately ask. Camus refuses to soften this truth. Many philosophies rush to fill the silence with comforting speculation. They invent hidden purposes or metaphysical plans that supposedly give meaning to existence. Camus calls this temptation philosophical escape. To invent meaning without evidence is to refuse the courage of clear thought. The absurd, therefore, arises precisely in the space between human expectation and cosmic indifference. A conscious mind demands explanation. Reality refuses to provide one. Neither side disappears. The human desire persists. The universe remains silent. The tension becomes permanent. This is why the absurd is not a passing mood. It is the fundamental situation of the thinking individual. Camus pushes the idea further. The absurd does not exist independently in either the human mind or the universe. It only appears when both are present simultaneously. If human beings did not demand meaning, the universe would simply exist without conflict. If the universe responded with clear purpose, the human mind would feel satisfied. But the combination of these two realities produces friction that cannot be resolved. Human beings ask for meaning. The universe answers with silence. The absurd is born from that encounter. Many people misinterpret this realization as an argument for despair. Camus rejects that interpretation with precision. The absurd does not say that life has no value. It says that value is not given by the structure of the universe. This distinction is crucial. If meaning were guaranteed by the universe, human freedom would shrink dramatically. Every action would simply fulfill a predetermined purpose. But once the universe refuses to provide meaning, the individual confronts a terrifying and exhilarating possibility. Meaning must be created rather than discovered. Before this possibility can be explored, however, the absurd must be fully understood. Camus insists that we resist the temptation to escape too quickly into new illusions. The confrontation must remain honest. Consider the psychological reaction that occurs when someone fully grasps the absurd condition. At first, the realization produces disorientation. A person begins to question assumptions that previously felt unshakable. Career ambitions appear strangely fragile. Social expectations lose their authority. Even moral certainty can feel less absolute. The individual suddenly sees how much of life depends on agreements rather than universal truths. This experience often produces anxiety because the human mind prefers stability. We want to believe that our choices are anchored in a larger cosmic order. When that order disappears, the ground beneath identity begins to tremble. Camus does not deny this anxiety. In fact, he believes the absurd awakening must pass through it. Clarity is rarely comfortable. To see the world without comforting illusions requires intellectual discipline and emotional courage. Most individuals instinctively retreat before reaching this level of honesty. They return to familiar narratives that promise certainty. Yet the absurd remains present beneath those narratives like a shadow waiting for recognition. The modern world illustrates this tension clearly. In an age of unprecedented technological progress, the human longing for meaning has not disappeared. If anything, it has intensified. People pursue success with feverish intensity. They chase recognition, wealth, influence, validation. They fill every moment with stimulation. Yet the deeper question remains untouched. Why does existence itself matter? Technology can accelerate communication. It can extend life expectancy. It can provide endless entertainment. But it cannot answer the fundamental question of meaning. The universe continues to respond with the same ancient silence. This is why Camus insists that the absurd remains the central philosophical issue even in the contemporary world. A human being living in the era of 2025 may carry a device capable of accessing the entire digital knowledge of civilization. Yet that device cannot answer the question that haunted philosophers thousands of years earlier. Why should existence exist at all? The absurd exposes the limits of human explanation, and yet within that limit something remarkable appears. When the individual recognizes that the universe offers no predetermined meaning, he simultaneously recognizes that meaning has always depended on human interpretation. The values guiding life are not written into the stars. They emerge from conscious choice. This realization transforms the psychological landscape of existence. Instead of receiving meaning from above, the individual begins to understand that meaning must be forged through living itself. Actions become expressions of freedom rather than obedience to cosmic instructions. But this freedom is not comfortable. It demands responsibility. If the universe does not dictate purpose, then the human being cannot hide behind destiny. Every decision becomes an act of creation. Every value must be defended by lived commitment rather than external authority. The absurd, therefore, exposes both the fragility and the dignity of human existence. Fragility because nothing guarantees the meaning we pursue. Dignity because meaning becomes the result of conscious engagement rather than passive acceptance. Camus sees this tension reflected in the deepest layers of human psychology. Even when individuals claim to believe in predetermined purpose, their daily actions reveal something else. People constantly choose what to care about. They prioritize relationships, ambitions, and ideals according to personal judgment. In practice, human beings already create meaning through their choices. The absurd simply reveals this process openly. Yet before this creative dimension of existence can fully emerge, the confrontation with the absurd must reach its most uncomfortable point. The mind must ask the question that every philosophy eventually encounters, but few dare to examine without hesitation. If life has no predetermined meaning, is it still worth living? The absurd does not automatically answer this question. Instead, it sharpens it with brutal clarity. Once the illusion of guaranteed purpose collapses, the value of existence itself becomes a problem that must be faced directly. Camus understood that this question cannot remain theoretical. It demands a personal response from every conscious individual, and it is precisely at the edge of this terrifying question that another image begins to rise from the depths of ancient myth. An image of a figure condemned to endless labor, pushing a massive stone up a mountain only to watch it roll back again. A figure whose struggle appears meaningless, yet strangely reveals something profound about the dignity of human awareness. Human dignity does not begin with victory. It begins with awareness. A man pushes a stone up a mountain. The stone slips. It rolls back to the valley. The man descends, lifts it again, and begins the same ascent. No reward waits at the summit. No final completion redeems the labor. The task repeats without end. At first glance, this image appears cruel, almost pointless. Yet Albert Camus places this figure at the center of his philosophy because it exposes the deepest truth about human existence. The myth of Sisyphus is not simply an ancient punishment story. It is a mirror held up to the condition of every conscious life. Camus does not choose Sisyphus accidentally. Long before modern thinkers spoke about alienation, repetition, and existential anxiety, the ancient Greeks had already imagined a man condemned to endless labor. The gods punish Sisyphus for his defiance by forcing him into a task that never reaches completion. The rock must be pushed upward forever. Each ascent ends with the same collapse. The structure is brutally simple: effort without final result, action without ultimate justification, movement without destination. Camus recognizes immediately that this myth describes something deeper than divine punishment. It describes the rhythm of human life itself. Every day, the individual repeats the same pattern of effort. Work replaces work. Desire replaces desire. Goals are pursued, achieved, and replaced by new goals. Life moves forward through cycles that rarely deliver final resolution. The absurd condition appears again. Human beings crave purpose, yet existence often presents itself as repetition without ultimate meaning. The myth of Sisyphus strips this tension down to its purest form. But Camus does something radical with this image. Instead of seeing Sisyphus as a tragic victim, he turns him into a symbol of human dignity. The key lies in one crucial element of the myth: consciousness. Sisyphus knows his condition. The rock is not pushed in ignorance. The labor is not disguised by illusion. The repetition is not hidden behind promises of future reward. Sisyphus is fully aware that his task has no final completion, and yet he continues. This awareness transforms the meaning of the entire situation. Most human beings live within structures that resemble Sisyphus's labor. We wake, we work, we pursue goals that dissolve with time, and eventually death erases the evidence of our efforts. But unlike the mythical figure, people often protect themselves with illusions. They imagine that their labor is justified by some ultimate purpose. They believe their actions participate in a cosmic narrative that guarantees meaning. Sisyphus possesses no such illusions. His condition is naked. He pushes the stone because the stone must be pushed. Camus sees in this clarity the birth of philosophical courage. The absurd man does not deny the lack of ultimate meaning. He recognizes it fully. Yet recognition does not destroy his capacity to act. In fact, it strengthens it. Here, Camus introduces one of his most powerful insights. The most important moment in the myth does not occur during the ascent of the rock. It occurs during the descent. After the stone falls, Sisyphus walks back down the mountain. This is the moment of consciousness. He sees the futility of the task waiting for him. He knows the cycle will repeat. The mountain does not change. The rock does not disappear. The effort will begin again exactly as before. And yet, in that descent, something extraordinary appears. Freedom of awareness. The gods may control the task, but they cannot control Sisyphus's consciousness. They cannot prevent him from understanding his condition. They cannot force him to believe that the task possesses meaning it does not have. This awareness becomes a form of rebellion. Sisyphus accepts the reality of his punishment without surrendering his dignity. The rock still exists. The mountain still stands. But his mind refuses submission to illusion. Camus interprets this moment as the birth of the absurd hero. The absurd hero is not defined by victory. He is defined by clarity. He sees the structure of his existence without comforting lies. He recognizes the absence of ultimate meaning, yet continues to live with intensity. The struggle itself becomes the center of his existence. Camus insists that this transformation requires a radical shift in perspective. Most people measure life according to final outcomes: success, completion, recognition, legacy. These goals promise that effort will eventually be justified by results. But the absurd perspective dissolves this expectation. If existence itself has no predetermined meaning, then final outcomes lose their absolute authority. What remains is the experience of living itself. The climb becomes more important than the summit. Sisyphus pushes the rock not because the task leads to fulfillment, but because the act of pushing expresses his existence. His struggle becomes a form of affirmation. Each movement declares that he is still alive and conscious within a universe that offers no final explanation. This is why Camus writes one of the most provocative sentences in modern philosophy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The statement shocks readers because it contradicts ordinary assumptions about happiness. People usually associate happiness with success, stability, and resolution. Sisyphus possesses none of these conditions. His labor never ends. His effort never produces a permanent result. Yet Camus suggests that happiness does not require cosmic meaning. Happiness may emerge from the intensity of living itself. When Sisyphus accepts the absurd nature of his condition without surrendering his will to act, he becomes stronger than the punishment designed to break him. The gods can impose the task, but they cannot impose despair. His consciousness becomes a form of defiance. This defiance contains a profound psychological insight. Human suffering often intensifies when individuals demand that life provide meaning beyond their control. When expectations collapse, despair emerges. But when a person accepts the limits of the universe and shifts attention toward the experience of living, the relationship with existence changes. The struggle becomes personal rather than imposed. Camus does not romanticize suffering. He does not claim that pain becomes pleasant once accepted. Instead, he argues that awareness transforms the meaning of effort. The absurd hero does not wait for justification. He creates dignity through action itself. In the modern world, this lesson becomes increasingly relevant. People often imagine that happiness depends on reaching some final state of completion, a perfect career, a perfect relationship, a permanent sense of security. Yet reality rarely provides such stable endings. Goals evolve, circumstances shift, achievements lose their initial intensity. Life continues moving. The pattern begins to resemble the endless labor of Sisyphus. Effort repeats itself in different forms. Projects replace projects. Desires change shape, but never disappear. The modern individual often experiences this repetition as frustration. The expectation of final fulfillment creates disappointment when life refuses to deliver it. Camus challenges this expectation directly. Perhaps the problem is not the repetition itself. Perhaps the problem is the belief that repetition should lead to ultimate completion. Once that belief collapses, the individual can begin to see life differently. The value of existence shifts from final results to lived intensity. Each action becomes meaningful because it expresses the conscious engagement of a human being within the absurd condition. The figure of Sisyphus reveals this possibility with brutal clarity. He does not escape the mountain. He does not destroy the rock. He does not discover hidden meaning behind his punishment. Instead, he continues pushing. And in that continuation, something paradoxical appears. The very struggle that was meant to humiliate him becomes the source of his dignity. The absurd hero transforms necessity into affirmation. The rock rolls down again. Sisyphus descends the mountain once more. The cycle repeats. But now the repetition contains a different meaning, not cosmic purpose, not divine justice, something quieter yet more powerful. Conscious rebellion. Camus sees in this rebellion the true nobility of the human spirit. A person who confronts the absurd without surrendering to despair demonstrates a strength that no external authority can grant or remove. The universe may remain silent, but the human response to that silence becomes the arena where dignity is forged. Yet even this realization opens another unsettling question. If the absurd hero chooses to continue living despite the absence of ultimate meaning, then the mind must examine the other possible responses to the absurd condition. For once, the human being fully understands the situation of Sisyphus Another question inevitably rises from the depths of consciousness. If life resembles the endless struggle of pushing a stone up a mountain, why continue pushing at all? The absurd forces a decision. Awareness does not allow neutrality. Once a human being recognizes the silence of the universe and the endless repetition of existence, he cannot simply return to unconscious living. The mind has seen too much. The illusion of guaranteed meaning has collapsed, and at that moment a brutal question rises with unavoidable weight. If life has no predetermined purpose, should it continue at all? Albert Camus refuses to avoid this question. Many philosophers approach the problem of meaning with abstract language and theoretical distance. Camus cuts directly to the core. The most serious philosophical question is not what truth exists, not what knowledge is possible, but whether life is worth living. Everything else becomes secondary, because once the absurd is recognized, the human being stands before a choice that cannot be ignored. Camus identifies three possible responses to this confrontation. Each response reveals a different way of dealing with the tension between human longing and cosmic silence. The first response is physical suicide. At first glance, this appears to be the most logical conclusion. If existence has no ultimate meaning, then continuing to live may seem unnecessary. If the universe offers no justification for suffering, one might argue that ending life becomes a rational escape from absurdity. Camus examines this possibility with ruthless honesty. He does not dismiss it as cowardice or weakness. Instead, he treats it as a serious philosophical position that demands careful analysis. Suicide represents the ultimate acknowledgement that life lacks meaning. It declares that existence itself has failed to justify its continuation. But Camus ultimately rejects this response, not because suicide is morally wrong in some abstract sense, but because it misunderstands the nature of the absurd. The absurd arises from the confrontation between human consciousness and the silence of the world. If consciousness disappears, the confrontation disappears as well. Suicide eliminates one side of the equation. It resolves the tension not by confronting the absurd, but by escaping it entirely. In this sense, suicide becomes a surrender rather than a response. It destroys the question instead of living within it. Camus sees this as a tragic mistake. The absurd does not demand the destruction of life. It demands the recognition of life's condition. To end existence is to abandon the very consciousness that allowed the absurd to be understood in the first place. The absurd hero refuses that surrender. Instead of escaping the tension, he continues to live inside it. Yet physical suicide is not the only escape available to the human mind. Camus identifies a second response that appears less dramatic, but is far more common. He calls it philosophical suicide. This form of escape occurs when thinkers recognize the absurd but immediately attempt to overcome it by inventing meaning beyond rational evidence. The mind cannot tolerate the silence of the universe, so it constructs a metaphysical explanation that restores purpose. Religion often performs this function. A person confronts the absurd condition and responds by declaring that the universe must possess hidden meaning. Perhaps a divine plan governs existence. Perhaps suffering leads to eternal reward. Perhaps life on Earth is only a temporary stage within a larger cosmic narrative. Camus does not deny the emotional comfort of these beliefs. They offer stability in a universe that appears indifferent. They promise justice beyond the limits of human history. But he argues that they also require a leap away from intellectual honesty. The absurd emerges precisely because human reason cannot find ultimate meaning in the structure of reality. To solve this problem by asserting meaning without proof, is to abandon the clarity that gave rise to the absurd in the first place. It is a retreat disguised as faith. Camus observes that many great philosophers attempted to perform this escape. They began by acknowledging the absurd condition, but eventually introduced metaphysical solutions that restored cosmic purpose. The mind, unable to tolerate uncertainty, created explanations that could not be verified. This movement from clarity to belief represents philosophical suicide. The thinker sacrifices reason in order to regain comfort. Camus refuses this sacrifice. For him, the absurd demands radical honesty. If the universe does not provide meaning, then human beings must resist the temptation to invent meaning simply to avoid discomfort. The tension between longing and silence must remain visible. This position requires immense psychological strength. Most people prefer certainty to truth. They would rather believe in comforting narratives than face the possibility that existence lacks ultimate explanation. Philosophical suicide satisfies this desire by restoring purpose through faith or metaphysical speculation. But Camus insists that clarity must not be abandoned. The absurd must remain unresolved. This brings us to the third response: existential rebellion. Unlike suicide, rebellion does not destroy life. Unlike philosophical escape, rebellion does not invent illusions. Instead, it accepts the absurd condition fully and continues to live with open awareness of its tension. Rebellion begins with a refusal. The human being refuses both despair and false consolation. He acknowledges that the universe offers no predetermined meaning, yet he refuses to surrender his capacity to act, to experience, to create. He lives without appeal to higher justification. This is the path Camus calls revolt. Revolt does not eliminate the absurd. It keeps the absurd alive within consciousness. Every moment of living becomes a confrontation between human desire and cosmic silence. The individual chooses to remain within that confrontation rather than escaping it. This choice transforms existence. When a person stops searching for ultimate meaning outside life, attention returns to the immediacy of living itself. Experience becomes more intense because it is no longer justified by distant goals or eternal promises. Each moment stands on its own. The absurd individual lives without illusion, but also without resignation. Rebellion, therefore, contains a paradox. The universe offers no meaning, yet the act of rebellion itself becomes meaningful. By continuing to live with clarity, the individual affirms the value of consciousness despite the silence surrounding it. Camus sees this affirmation as the true dignity of human existence. The rebel does not pretend that life possesses hidden purpose. He simply refuses to let the absence of purpose destroy his engagement with the world. The struggle itself becomes the arena where freedom emerges. Consider again the image of Sisyphus. His rebellion does not consist in escaping the mountain. It consists in pushing the rock while fully aware of the futility of the task. The gods cannot break him because he refuses to accept despair as the final interpretation of his condition. He continues, and in that continuation, his existence becomes an act of defiance. Camus believes this attitude represents the most honest response to the absurd. It neither denies reality nor surrenders to it completely. Instead, it transforms awareness into action. The rebel says yes to life, even while recognizing its lack of ultimate justification. This perspective changes how we understand freedom. Most people imagine freedom as the ability to achieve desired outcomes. But the absurd condition reveals that many outcomes remain beyond human control. Death will arrive, time will erase achievements, the universe will remain silent. True freedom therefore emerges from a different source. It appears when the individual stops demanding guarantees from existence. Once the expectation of cosmic meaning disappears, life becomes an open field of possibilities. Actions are no longer measured against eternal purpose. They are measured against the intensity and authenticity with which they are lived. The rebel creates value through engagement rather than discovery. This does not mean that all values become equal. Camus does not advocate chaos or moral indifference. Instead, he argues that values must arise from lived experience rather than metaphysical certainty. Rebellion remains grounded in human dignity. The rebel fights against injustice not because the universe commands it, but because human suffering demands response. Solidarity emerges not from divine law, but from shared vulnerability. In this sense, rebellion becomes both a philosophical and ethical stance. It accepts the absurd, yet refuses cruelty. It recognizes the limits of meaning, yet continues to act with responsibility. Camus understands that this path requires constant effort. The temptation to escape the absurd never disappears. At moments of exhaustion, the mind longs for certainty or release. Yet rebellion renews itself each time the individual chooses clarity over illusion. The struggle becomes permanent, and through that struggle a new kind of life begins to appear. A life lived without appeal to ultimate justification, yet filled with conscious engagement. A life where freedom grows from the acceptance of limits rather than their denial. But once rebellion becomes the chosen response to the absurd, another question slowly emerges from the shadows of this philosophy. If a human being refuses both despair and illusion, if he accepts the absurd and chooses to continue living consciously within it, then the next challenge becomes unavoidable. How should such a life actually be lived? To rebel is not to destroy the absurd. It is to live inside it without surrender. Once the human being refuses both physical suicide and philosophical escape, another path becomes unavoidable. The absurd still exists. The universe remains silent. The human hunger for meaning continues to burn. Nothing in reality has changed. Only the attitude toward that reality has transformed. Albert Camus calls this transformation revolt. Revolt begins with a clear refusal. The individual refuses to escape into illusion. He refuses to collapse into despair. He chooses instead to remain fully conscious within the tension between human longing and cosmic indifference. This choice appears simple, yet it demands extraordinary courage. Most people prefer comfort to clarity. They want life to guarantee justice, purpose, or redemption. They want the universe to confirm that suffering leads somewhere meaningful. When those guarantees disappear, fear emerges. The mind begins searching desperately for new illusions. Revolt refuses that search. The rebel does not claim that existence possesses hidden meaning. He does not pretend that suffering is secretly justified by divine plans or historical destiny. He sees the world as it is, a world where meaning is not given in advance, and yet he chooses to live intensely. This decision transforms the entire structure of human existence. Before the absurd awakening, many individuals live according to promises about the future. They work because they expect final reward. They endure suffering because they believe it leads to ultimate justice. Life becomes a bridge toward some distant resolution. But once revolt begins, that distant resolution disappears. The rebel understands that the universe offers no final guarantee. There is no cosmic script waiting to justify every action. There is only the present moment and the conscious being living inside it. Paradoxically, this realization does not weaken life. It intensifies it. When meaning is no longer postponed into the future, every moment becomes heavier with significance. Experience itself becomes the center of existence. The rebel does not wait for life to reveal its purpose. He lives as if living itself is the act of purpose. Camus sees in this attitude a profound affirmation of life. The rebel says yes to existence without illusions. He does not demand that life explain itself before he participates in it. Instead, he enters the struggle fully aware of its limits. This is not optimism. Camus rejects the idea that life secretly improves if one simply adopts a positive mindset. The rebel does not deny suffering or tragedy. War still exists. Death still approaches. Loss still wounds the human heart. Revolt does not remove these realities. It removes the expectation that they must be justified by something greater. Once that expectation disappears, a strange freedom begins to emerge. If the universe does not dictate meaning, then human beings are no longer bound by the need to discover it in advance. Values become creations rather than discoveries. The rebel shapes his life through choices rather than waiting for cosmic instructions. Freedom, therefore, appears not as limitless possibility but as conscious responsibility. Every decision becomes an act of creation. Camus understands that this freedom can feel frightening. Without external guarantees, individuals must take ownership of their actions. There is no divine authority to confirm that choices are correct. There is only the clarity of consciousness and the consequences of living. Yet, within this responsibility lies dignity. The rebel stands upright in a silent universe. He does not bow before illusions. He does not ask permission from metaphysical powers that never answer. Instead, he lives according to a simple yet radical principle: to live without appeal. This phrase captures the essence of Camus' philosophy. Living without appeal means refusing to justify existence through promises beyond the world itself. The rebel does not appeal to eternity. He does not appeal to destiny. He does not appeal to hidden meaning. He lives here, now, within the limits of human life. This attitude transforms the relationship between the individual and time. Many people treat the present as preparation for the future. They postpone living until certain conditions are achieved. Success must arrive. Stability must be secured. Happiness must be guaranteed. But revolt rejects this postponement. If life contains no predetermined meaning, then waiting for meaning becomes pointless. The rebel embraces the immediacy of experience. The present moment becomes the primary arena where existence unfolds. Camus often speaks about intensity. The rebel seeks not eternal meaning, but full engagement with life. Work, love, struggle, creation, all of these become expressions of existence rather than steps toward final fulfillment. This perspective returns us again to the image of Sisyphus. The rebel pushes the rock not because the task leads somewhere, but because the act itself expresses his presence in the world. Each movement affirms that he remains alive and conscious. The mountain does not justify him. He justifies the climb. This shift from external purpose to internal engagement defines the spirit of revolt. Yet Camus warns that rebellion must not become another illusion. Revolt is not blind defiance against everything. It is not chaos or destruction. The rebel does not reject reality itself. He accepts reality completely. The limits of existence remain real. Death cannot be avoided. Time cannot be reversed. The universe will never explain itself. Revolt operates inside these boundaries rather than denying them. The rebel lives with clear eyes. This clarity protects revolt from becoming fanaticism. History offers many examples of movements that began with rebellion but ended in oppression. When individuals believe their cause possesses absolute meaning, they often justify violence in its name. Camus refuses this logic. Because the rebel recognizes that meaning is not guaranteed by the universe, he cannot claim absolute authority for his own beliefs. Revolt therefore contains humility as well as strength. The rebel fights injustice without believing he owns ultimate truth. He resists oppression without imagining that history will inevitably reward him. His struggle remains grounded in human experience rather than metaphysical certainty. This perspective carries profound ethical implications. When the universe offers no final moral authority, the responsibility for ethical action returns to human beings themselves. The rebel must decide how to live in a way that respects the dignity of others who share the same absurd condition, because every human being faces the same silent universe. Every human being carries the same fragile consciousness within a vast, indifferent cosmos. This shared condition creates a subtle bond between individuals. The rebel recognizes that others struggle against the same absurd reality. They also wake each morning without cosmic guarantees. They also confront suffering without ultimate explanation. From this recognition, a form of solidarity begins to emerge. Not the solidarity of ideology or religion, but the solidarity of shared existence. The rebel sees in other human beings companions in the same uncertain journey. This awareness prevents revolt from collapsing into selfishness. Living intensely does not mean ignoring the suffering of others. On the contrary, the rebel understands that the value of life grows precisely through relationships, cooperation, and mutual respect. In a universe without predetermined meaning, human connection becomes one of the most powerful forms of value creation. The rebel, therefore, refuses cruelty, not because cruelty violates divine commandments, but because it destroys the fragile dignity shared by conscious beings. When individuals inflict suffering on others in the name of absolute truth, they betray the very clarity that revolt demands. Revolt must remain human. This is why Camus often describes rebellion as a balance between defiance and restraint. The rebel resists injustice fiercely, but refuses to become a tyrant in the process. He fights without claiming absolute authority. He acts without believing he controls the destiny of the universe. He lives without illusions, yet refuses despair. Through this balance, revolt becomes not a single act, but a continuous attitude toward life. Each day, the individual renews the decision to live consciously within the absurd condition. Each day, the rebel refuses both escape and surrender, and slowly another discovery begins to appear within this philosophy. When illusions about cosmic meaning disappear, something unexpected emerges in their place. A deeper sense of freedom begins to grow. The rebel, who no longer waits for the universe to justify existence, suddenly realizes that life has opened into a space of possibility. Without predetermined meaning, human beings gain the power to shape their own values. And this realization leads to a new and unsettling question that waits quietly behind the act of revolt. If the absurd liberates the individual from the illusion of cosmic purpose, then what kind of freedom truly begins when those illusions finally fall away? Freedom does not begin when life becomes easy. It begins when illusion collapses. A human being spends most of his life believing that meaning exists somewhere outside himself. Religion promises divine purpose. Society promises success. History promises progress. Each promise whispers the same reassurance. Your life already has a role written into the structure of the universe. Albert Camus destroys this comfort with ruthless clarity. The universe does not assign meaning. It does not provide destiny. It does not guarantee that human existence serves a final purpose. When the absurd is recognized, that comforting narrative dissolves. What remains is a human being standing inside a silent cosmos. At first, this silence appears terrifying. Without predetermined meaning, the individual feels exposed. If nothing in the universe dictates purpose, then life seems suspended in uncertainty. The mind begins to ask a frightening question. If there is no cosmic plan, what guides human action at all? Yet Camus sees within this terrifying realization the birth of something powerful: freedom. Not the shallow freedom celebrated by modern slogans, not the freedom of endless options or temporary pleasures. Camus speaks of a deeper freedom that emerges precisely when the illusion of cosmic meaning disappears. Before confronting the absurd, many individuals live under invisible chains. They believe their lives must fulfill some external destiny. They follow moral systems not because they understand them, but because they fear disobedience. They pursue careers, reputations, and ambitions that society declares meaningful. Their choices appear free, yet those choices are guided by expectations they never questioned. The absurd breaks those chains. When a person understands that the universe does not provide ultimate meaning, something radical happens. The authority that once dictated purpose begins to fade. The individual no longer needs to align his life with a predetermined cosmic narrative. Existence becomes open. This openness produces a strange psychological transformation. The rebel who accepts the absurd realizes that life is no longer measured by eternal standards. There is no divine scoreboard waiting beyond death. There is no final judgment confirming that one life mattered more than another. What remains is the experience of living itself. This realization returns the responsibility for meaning directly to the human being. If the universe does not define purpose, then purpose must emerge from conscious action. Value becomes something created through living rather than something discovered in metaphysical truth. Camus does not treat this as a burden alone. He sees in it the beginning of authentic freedom. Freedom appears when human beings stop demanding guarantees from the universe. The moment one abandons the expectation that life must justify itself through cosmic meaning, the field of existence expands. Actions no longer require eternal validation. They require only conscious engagement. This shift changes the way individuals understand success and failure. In traditional thinking, success often depends on reaching goals that promise lasting significance: wealth, recognition, influence. These achievements appear meaningful because they seem to endure beyond the present moment. But the absurd perspective dissolves this illusion. Time erases achievements. Death interrupts every ambition. History forgets even the most powerful figures. The universe does not preserve human accomplishments as eternal monuments. Once this truth is accepted, success loses its mythical aura, and failure loses its terror. The absurd individual understands that both success and failure belong to the same fragile human drama. Neither outcome possesses ultimate significance in the cosmic sense. What matters is the intensity with which life is lived. Freedom, therefore, emerges from the collapse of exaggerated expectations. When a person stops believing that his life must achieve eternal importance, he becomes capable of living with greater honesty. Choices are no longer made in obedience to imagined cosmic rules. They arise from personal conviction and immediate experience. Camus insists that this freedom does not lead to chaos. Critics often assume that abandoning universal meaning produces moral emptiness. If nothing has absolute value, then everything becomes permissible. But Camus rejects this conclusion as superficial. The absurd does not eliminate values, it changes their source. Values no longer descend from divine authority or metaphysical truth. They emerge from the lived reality of human existence. A person who understands the absurd recognizes that every conscious being shares the same fragile condition. We live briefly, we suffer, we search for meaning within limits we cannot escape. This shared condition creates the foundation for ethical awareness. The rebel does not respect others because a cosmic law commands it. He respects them because they stand beside him within the same uncertain universe. Their lives carry the same fragile dignity that his own life carries. Freedom, therefore, becomes inseparable from responsibility. When external authorities lose their power, individuals must create values that sustain human coexistence. The absurd individual cannot hide behind destiny or divine command. Every decision reflects a personal commitment to the kind of life he chooses to affirm. Camus sees this responsibility as a defining feature of authentic freedom. The free individual does not ask what the universe demands. He asks what kind of life he is willing to create. This question transforms the meaning of everyday existence. Work, love, creativity, friendship, all of these activities gain new depth once they are freed from the illusion of cosmic necessity. They are no longer steps toward eternal fulfillment. They become expressions of human engagement within the limits of the present. The absurd individual does not work because work fulfills a divine plan. He works because the act of effort expresses his presence in the world. He does not love because love guarantees eternal reward. He loves because connection intensifies the experience of living. He does not create art because art will survive forever. He creates because creativity affirms life against the silence surrounding it. In this way, freedom transforms ordinary existence into something profoundly vivid. The absence of cosmic meaning does not empty life. It concentrates it. Every moment becomes heavier with possibility. Yet Camus warns that this freedom must remain conscious of its limits. The absurd does not grant unlimited power. Human beings remain fragile creatures bound by time, mortality, and circumstance. Freedom exists within those boundaries. The rebel does not deny limits. He lives within them deliberately. This balance between freedom and limitation defines the mature response to the absurd. Without limits, freedom becomes destructive. Without freedom, life becomes mechanical. Camus seeks a philosophy that holds both realities together. Freedom grows from the recognition of limits. When the individual stops dreaming about eternal meaning, he becomes capable of appreciating the intensity of finite life. Mortality itself begins to sharpen the experience of existence. Because life does not last forever, each moment becomes precious. The absurd individual does not hope for immortality. He embraces the urgency of the present. This urgency produces a particular style of living that Camus admired deeply, a life rich with experience, curiosity, creativity, and engagement. The free individual does not retreat into isolation or despair. He participates fully in the world while remaining aware of its silence. He lives without illusions, yet refuses indifference. This attitude also protects freedom from becoming selfish indulgence. Some might interpret the absence of cosmic meaning as permission to pursue pleasure without restraint. Camus rejects this interpretation as shallow. True freedom does not consist in consuming experiences without reflection. It consists in choosing a life that affirms human dignity despite the absurd condition. The rebel, therefore, measures his actions not by divine command, but by their impact on the fragile community of conscious beings. Freedom becomes meaningful only when it respects the freedom of others. In this sense, the absurd philosophy leads naturally toward an ethics grounded in human solidarity. But this solidarity must remain vigilant. History shows that human beings often transform ideals of freedom into instruments of oppression. Movements that begin with rebellion against injustice sometimes evolve into rigid systems demanding absolute obedience. Camus witnessed such transformations during his own lifetime. Revolutionary movements that promised liberation often justified violence in the name of historical necessity. Leaders claimed that their vision of justice was so important that any sacrifice could be justified. Camus recognized the danger immediately. When individuals believe they possess absolute truth, freedom disappears. The rebel who once resisted oppression becomes a tyrant enforcing his own certainty. This realization introduces a crucial problem within the philosophy of revolt. If freedom arises from the rejection of absolute meaning, how can rebellion avoid turning into another form of domination? How can individuals resist injustice without claiming total authority over truth? The absurd philosophy now approaches one of its most delicate questions. If human beings must create their own values in a silent universe, what prevents those values from becoming extreme, destructive, or tyrannical? Freedom without limits becomes violence. This is the danger Albert Camus saw with terrifying clarity. When human beings abandon the illusion of cosmic meaning, they gain a powerful form of freedom. They no longer obey divine destiny or historical inevitability. They become creators of value. But this same freedom contains a hidden threat. A human being who believes he creates meaning may begin to believe he owns truth. And when someone believes he owns truth, he may begin to believe that anything can be justified in its name. Camus refuses this conclusion with relentless force. Revolt, if it is to remain human, must recognize limits. The absurd already revealed that the universe offers no absolute moral authority. But this does not mean that every action becomes acceptable. On the contrary, the absence of cosmic meaning demands an even deeper awareness of responsibility. Without divine command or eternal law, the burden of ethics falls entirely on human beings. The rebel must choose not only how to live, but also where to stop. This is where Camus introduces the idea of moral limits. The rebel begins with a refusal. He refuses injustice. He refuses humiliation. He refuses systems that crush human dignity. Revolt begins when a human being declares that something cannot be tolerated. But the moment of rebellion contains a paradox. When a person says no to oppression, he simultaneously affirms a value. He declares that human dignity matters. He asserts that certain boundaries must not be crossed. In this sense, rebellion is not pure destruction. It is the defense of a fragile moral space where human life retains value. Camus insists that rebellion must never forget this origin. The rebel fights injustice precisely because human beings possess dignity. If rebellion destroys that dignity in the process, it betrays its own foundation. History offers countless examples of this betrayal. Revolutions often begin with noble intentions. People rise against tyranny, inequality, and oppression. They demand justice. They demand freedom. But once power shifts, something disturbing often occurs. The rebels begin to believe that their cause is absolute. Once a movement claims absolute truth, limits disappear. Violence becomes acceptable because the cause is considered sacred. Individuals become expendable because history supposedly demands sacrifice. The language of justice transforms into the language of necessity. Camus watched this transformation unfold during the violent political struggles of the 20th century. Ideologies promised liberation, yet justified mass suffering. Leaders declared that millions could be sacrificed in the name of a perfect future. The logic seemed simple and terrifying. If the goal is absolute justice, then any method becomes acceptable. Camus rejects this logic entirely. The absurd philosophy already revealed that no human idea possesses absolute authority. The universe itself offers no final validation of human plans. If this is true, then no political movement, no ideology, no revolutionary project can claim the right to destroy human life in the name of ultimate truth. Revolt must remain modest. The rebel knows that he fights injustice not because he possesses perfect knowledge, but because he recognizes suffering. His rebellion arises from human experience rather than metaphysical certainty. This awareness creates a natural boundary. The rebel refuses injustice, but he also refuses to become an executioner in the name of justice. He resists oppression, but he does not believe that the future justifies unlimited violence. Camus describes this position as a philosophy of limits. Limits do not weaken rebellion, they protect it. Without limits, revolt becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. A movement that claims absolute authority inevitably begins to silence dissent. It punishes disagreement. It sacrifices individuals for the imagined perfection of tomorrow. The rebel must reject this path. He fights oppression because human life matters now, not because it might serve a distant utopia. He protects dignity in the present rather than sacrificing it for an abstract future. This attitude requires constant vigilance. The temptation to abandon limits always returns. When suffering becomes intense, the desire for total solutions grows stronger. People begin to believe that extreme measures are necessary to create justice. Violence appears seductive because it promises immediate transformation. Camus warns that this temptation is one of the greatest dangers facing humanity. When rebellion forgets its limits, it becomes another form of domination. The absurd philosophy therefore demands an ethical discipline that many revolutions lack. The rebel must resist injustice without believing that he owns absolute truth. He must act with conviction while accepting the possibility of error. This humility distinguishes authentic rebellion from fanaticism. Fanatics believe they possess final answers. Rebels understand that human knowledge remains incomplete. They fight for justice while recognizing that their vision of justice may never be perfect. This recognition creates space for dialogue, restraint, and compassion. The rebel does not seek to destroy opponents completely. He seeks to resist actions that violate human dignity. His struggle remains grounded in the shared vulnerability of human existence. Every person lives under the same silent universe. Every person experiences fear, suffering, hope, and mortality. The rebel remembers this common condition even when confronting enemies. This memory prevents rebellion from becoming hatred. Camus believed that hatred is one of the most destructive forces in human history. Once hatred dominates the heart, moral limits collapse. Violence becomes pleasurable. The suffering of others becomes irrelevant. Revolt must reject hatred. It must remain anchored in the defense of human dignity rather than the destruction of enemies. This distinction is subtle but essential. The rebel opposes injustice fiercely, yet he refuses to abandon the humanity of those he opposes. Such restraint demands enormous inner strength. It is easier to believe that opponents are monsters. It is easier to justify cruelty when enemies appear less than human. But the philosophy of the absurd refuses these simplifications. Human beings remain complex and flawed creatures. No ideology can purify them completely. No revolution can eliminate conflict permanently. The rebel, therefore, fights without illusions about final victory. He knows that injustice may return. He knows that history rarely delivers perfect justice. Yet, he continues to resist because resistance itself affirms human dignity. This perspective transforms the meaning of moral action. Ethics no longer depend on achieving a perfect world. They depend on preserving the fragile space where human life retains value. The rebel acts not because success is guaranteed, but because refusing injustice defines what it means to remain human. Camus admired this quiet courage more than grand ideological victories. The rebel who protects limits preserves the possibility of freedom for everyone. He refuses to sacrifice individuals for abstract ideals. He recognizes that the dignity of a single human life outweighs the promises of distant utopias. In this sense, rebellion becomes both resistance and restraint. It resists oppression. It restrains the temptation to become oppressive in return. This balance forms the ethical heart of Camus's philosophy. Yet the story does not end here. The recognition of limits opens another horizon. Once the rebel understands that every human being shares the same fragile condition, a deeper realization begins to emerge. Revolt is never purely individual. The moment a person declares that injustice cannot be tolerated, he speaks not only for himself, but for others who suffer under the same reality. His rebellion becomes a voice for a shared human experience. And within that realization, another idea slowly takes shape. If rebellion begins with the individual refusal of injustice, could it also lead toward a deeper form of human solidarity? The most dangerous revolution is the one that believes it is absolutely right. Albert Camus saw this danger spreading across the modern world with terrifying speed. Revolutions had once promised liberation. They began with cries against injustice, oppression, and humiliation. People rose up because they could no longer accept a world where dignity was crushed under power. Revolt began with a human refusal. But somewhere along the path from rebellion to revolution, something dark often entered the movement: certainty. Once rebels began to believe their cause represented absolute truth, the moral limits that protected human dignity began to collapse. Violence no longer appeared tragic, it appeared necessary. Sacrifice no longer meant suffering shared by all. It meant the suffering of others imposed in the name of history. Camus confronts this transformation with brutal clarity. Rebellion begins with the defense of human dignity. Radical revolution often ends by destroying it. The difference lies in how each one understands truth. The rebel knows that the universe offers no absolute authority. The absurd has already revealed that human beings live without cosmic guarantees. Because of this, the rebel remains cautious. He resists injustice, but he does not pretend that his vision of justice is perfect or eternal. The revolutionary who claims absolute truth abandons this humility. He believes that history itself has chosen his side. He believes the future belongs to his ideology. He believes that suffering today will be justified by the perfect world tomorrow. This belief is where danger begins. Once the future becomes sacred, the present becomes expendable. Camus observed this logic unfolding across the political ideologies of the 20th century. Movements that promised liberation built systems of terror. Governments that claimed to fight oppression created prisons, purges, and mass violence. Entire populations were sacrificed in the name of historical progress. The justification always sounded familiar. The revolution must succeed. The future demands sacrifice. Justice requires harsh measures. Camus refuses these arguments with relentless force. No future ideal can justify the destruction of human dignity in the present. The rebel who truly understands the absurd cannot accept such logic. Because if the universe contains no absolute meaning, then no ideology can claim divine authority over life and death. Every revolution that claims perfect truth begins to resemble the tyranny it once fought. The tragedy is not accidental. It emerges from a dangerous misunderstanding of rebellion itself. Revolt begins with a refusal of injustice, but it does not claim to possess the final blueprint for human perfection. Radical revolution, however, often transforms that refusal into a total system. It attempts to redesign society completely. It promises a final solution to human suffering. And when reality fails to match the dream, violence follows. Camus understood that human beings are deeply tempted by the idea of total solutions. The world is full of suffering, inequality, and chaos. It is natural to imagine that a perfect system might eliminate these problems forever. But the absurd philosophy rejects this fantasy. Human existence contains limits that no political project can erase. Conflict, error, and suffering belong to the human condition. History cannot be purified completely. Every attempt to impose perfect order risks destroying the freedom it claims to protect. This is why Camus calls for a philosophy of limits within political life. Limits protect humanity from the arrogance of absolute systems. A rebellion that respects limits fights injustice while accepting that perfection is impossible. It works to improve human conditions without believing it can reshape human nature entirely. Radical revolution rejects these limits. It believes history can be purified. It believes human beings can be transformed into flawless citizens. It believes the future will redeem every sacrifice made in the present. Camus calls this belief a dangerous illusion, because the future never arrives in the form imagined by revolutionaries. Every new regime inherits the same human imperfections it hoped to eliminate. Leaders become corrupt. Ideals become rigid dogma. The promise of liberation becomes a system of control. The revolution devours its own purpose. Camus insists that rebellion must resist this temptation. The rebel acts in defense of human dignity here and now. He does not sacrifice living individuals for abstract visions of tomorrow. His struggle remains grounded in the immediate experience of injustice. He fights suffering without believing he can eliminate it entirely. This realism distinguishes rebellion from ideological fanaticism. Fanatics believe history must follow their vision. Rebels know history remains unpredictable. Fanatics demand total obedience. Rebels protect individual freedom. Fanatics promise paradise after destruction. Rebels protect life even while resisting injustice. Camus saw this difference as essential for preserving humanity in a violent century. Without limits, revolutionary movements easily become machines of domination. Power concentrates in the hands of those who claim to represent the future. Dissent becomes betrayal. Criticism becomes treason. The language of justice becomes the language of fear. Camus rejects the idea that such violence is unavoidable. He believes human beings can resist injustice without abandoning moral boundaries. The key lies in recognizing the fragile dignity shared by every person. Every human life carries weight, not because divine authority declares it sacred, but because conscious beings share the same vulnerable existence. The rebel who understands this refuses to treat people as tools of history. He refuses to justify cruelty in the name of progress. He recognizes that a revolution which destroys human dignity has already betrayed its purpose. This insight leads to a radical shift in how political struggle should be understood. The goal is not to build a perfect world. The goal is to reduce injustice without destroying freedom. The rebel fights oppression, not because victory is guaranteed, but because resistance affirms human dignity. His struggle remains limited, patient, and grounded in human experience. He does not promise paradise. He protects the fragile space where people can live with dignity despite the absurd condition of existence. Camus believed this modest vision of rebellion was stronger than any grand ideology. It accepts the complexity of human life rather than denying it. It resists injustice while refusing the arrogance of absolute truth. Yet even this restrained rebellion reveals something deeper about human existence. When one person stands up and declares that injustice cannot be tolerated, that declaration rarely remains private. The refusal echoes beyond the individual. Others recognize their own suffering within the same cry. Rebellion spreads because human beings share the same vulnerable condition. The absurd revealed that we live without cosmic meaning, but it also revealed something else. No one faces that silence alone. Every human being stands beneath the same indifferent sky. Every person struggles against the same limits of mortality and uncertainty. Every person searches for dignity in a world that offers no guarantees. And slowly, within this shared struggle, a new realization begins to grow. The rebel who says no to injustice may also be speaking a hidden yes to something larger than himself. The moment a human being says no to injustice, he is already speaking for more than himself. Rebellion may begin in solitude. A single individual refuses humiliation. A single voice declares that suffering cannot continue. A single consciousness confronts power and says enough. At first, the act appears personal, almost fragile. One person standing against the weight of the world. But Albert Camus reveals something deeper hidden inside this moment. When a person rebels, he is not only defending himself, he is defending a value that extends beyond his own life. The rebel declares that there exists a boundary that must not be crossed. He insists that certain forms of suffering violate something fundamental within human existence. Even if he speaks alone, the claim carries a universal resonance, because every human being recognizes the same boundary. This is why rebellion rarely remains isolated. When one individual refuses injustice, others begin to see their own condition reflected in that refusal. They recognize their own dignity inside the rebel's voice. What began as a personal protest slowly becomes a shared awakening. Camus captures this transformation in a single powerful idea. I rebel, therefore we exist. The phrase overturns centuries of philosophical tradition. The famous declaration, I think, therefore I exist, describes the solitary consciousness discovering itself. Camus introduces a different foundation for human meaning. Existence is revealed not only through thought, but through rebellion. When a person refuses injustice, he implicitly affirms that human dignity matters for everyone. He speaks not only for himself, but for all those who suffer under the same conditions. His protest reveals a hidden community of experience. This discovery transforms the meaning of revolt. The rebel is no longer an isolated figure confronting the absurd universe alone. He becomes part of a fragile human solidarity built from shared vulnerability. Every person lives beneath the same silent cosmos. Every person confronts mortality, uncertainty, and suffering. The absurd condition is universal. Because of this universality, rebellion naturally expands into connection. When individuals recognize that others struggle under the same existential limits, empathy begins to emerge. The rebel understands that the dignity he defends in himself must also be defended in others. Solidarity grows from this recognition. Not the artificial unity imposed by ideology, not the forced loyalty demanded by political movements. Camus speaks of a deeper solidarity rooted in the shared human condition. We are united because we suffer. We are united because we search for meaning within the same indifferent universe. We are united because our lives carry the same fragile dignity. This solidarity does not erase individual freedom. It deepens it. The rebel remains responsible for his own choices, yet he understands that those choices exist within a broader human community. His actions influence the lives of others who share the same struggle. Freedom, therefore, becomes inseparable from responsibility toward fellow human beings. Camus believed this realization offered a new foundation for ethics. Traditional morality often depends on divine authority or metaphysical truth. People behave ethically because they believe a higher power commands them. But the absurd philosophy has already revealed that the universe offers no such guarantees. Ethics must therefore arise from human experience itself. Solidarity provides that foundation. When the rebel recognizes that every person shares the same fragile existence, he understands that cruelty destroys something essential within the human world. Violence does not simply harm individuals. It damages the fragile network of dignity that allows human life to retain meaning. To respect another person becomes an act of existential recognition. I see in you the same vulnerability that defines my own life. I recognize in your suffering the same condition that shapes my existence. This recognition transforms rebellion into something larger than resistance. It becomes a form of human alliance against the indifference of the universe. The absurd revealed that the cosmos offers no ultimate meaning. Yet human beings can still create meaning through their relationships with one another. Solidarity becomes a quiet act of defiance against the emptiness surrounding human life. When individuals support one another, they build a fragile structure of value within a silent world. Camus insists that this solidarity must remain honest. It cannot become another ideological system promising perfect harmony. Human beings remain flawed. Conflict will always exist. Disagreements will continue. Solidarity does not eliminate these tensions. It simply reminds us that every person participating in those conflicts shares the same existential condition. This awareness encourages humility. The rebel who understands solidarity cannot treat others as enemies to be destroyed. Even opponents remain part of the same human community struggling beneath the same sky. The struggle against injustice must therefore avoid becoming a war against humanity itself. Camus believed that many political movements forget this truth. They begin by defending human dignity, but end by dividing the world into absolute enemies and absolute allies. Once this division appears, violence becomes easier to justify. Opponents are no longer seen as fellow human beings, but as obstacles to be eliminated. Solidarity dissolves. Rebellion turns into domination. The absurd philosophy refuses this path. Because if every person shares the same fragile existence, then no ideology can justify treating human beings as expendable. The rebel must remain loyal to humanity itself. This loyalty gives rebellion a moral direction, even in a universe without cosmic meaning. The goal is not to achieve perfect harmony. The goal is to preserve the fragile dignity that allows human beings to live together despite the absurd condition. Solidarity becomes a quiet rebellion against isolation. It declares that even in a silent universe, human beings can still stand together. This idea carries profound implications for the modern world. In an age of technological acceleration and social fragmentation, individuals often feel more isolated than ever before. Information connects millions of people, yet genuine understanding grows weaker. The absurd condition becomes easier to forget, yet harder to escape. Many attempt to fill this emptiness with ideological certainty or personal ambition. Others retreat into private lives disconnected from broader human concerns. But Camus reminds us that isolation cannot resolve the absurd. The struggle against meaninglessness becomes stronger when shared. When individuals recognize their common vulnerability, they discover a source of strength that no ideology can manufacture. Solidarity transforms the absurd condition from a solitary burden into a collective experience. The rebel no longer stands alone against the silence of the universe. He stands beside others who confront the same silence. And within this shared resistance, another possibility begins to appear. If rebellion creates solidarity among human beings, then perhaps human creativity itself may become a way of affirming life against the absurd. Albert Camus believed that human beings possess one weapon against the absurd that cannot be taken away. Not faith, not ideology, not the promise of a perfect future. Something quieter, yet more powerful. Creation. When the universe refuses to provide meaning, the human being begins to produce meaning through the act of creation itself. Art becomes a gesture of defiance, a painter confronting the blank canvas, a writer confronting the empty page, a musician confronting silence and shaping it into sound. Each act declares the same quiet truth. The universe may not give meaning, but human beings can still shape experience into form. Camus saw artistic creation not as decoration for life, but as one of the most honest responses to the absurd condition. The artist does not escape the absurd. He does not pretend that life possesses hidden purpose. Instead, he captures the tension between longing and silence and transforms it into expression. Art becomes a mirror of the absurd world. The painter sees the chaos of existence and arranges it into images. The novelist observes the contradictions of human life and builds stories that reveal them. The poet confronts suffering and shapes it into language that refuses to disappear. None of these acts solve the absurd. They reveal it. And yet, within that revelation, something remarkable occurs. When chaos is shaped into form, even temporarily, the human being experiences a moment of clarity. Creation becomes a small victory against meaninglessness. Camus admired this victory because it remains honest. The artist does not claim to possess eternal truth. He does not promise that art will redeem the universe. Instead, he acknowledges the limits of existence while still affirming the power of human imagination. Creation becomes rebellion without illusion. In a world where nothing guarantees meaning, the act of creating meaning becomes an affirmation of life itself. The absurd individual understands this instinctively. If the universe remains silent, then the responsibility to speak falls upon human beings. If the cosmos offers no story explaining our existence, then storytelling itself becomes a way of resisting the void. Every painting, every novel, every piece of music becomes a declaration that human consciousness refuses to disappear quietly. The act of creation, therefore, contains both humility and courage. Humility, because the artist knows that his work cannot solve the absurd. Courage, because he creates anyway. Camus believed that this attitude reflects the deepest dignity of the human spirit. To create within an indifferent universe is to accept reality without surrendering to it. The artist says yes to life, even while recognizing its fragility. This philosophy also changes the way we understand beauty. Traditional thought often treats beauty as something eternal, something that reflects divine harmony or cosmic order. Camus rejects this idea. Beauty does not descend from the heavens. It emerges from the human confrontation with chaos. Beauty appears when the human mind organizes experience into form. A landscape painted on canvas does not change the mountains themselves, but it reveals the human capacity to perceive meaning within the world. A novel does not erase suffering, but it transforms suffering into understanding shared between writer and reader. Creation, therefore, connects individuals across time. When someone reads a story written decades earlier, a bridge forms between two consciousnesses separated by history. When a piece of music moves the heart, the listener experiences a moment of unity with the composer who first shaped those sounds. Art creates solidarity across generations. Camus saw this connection as another quiet rebellion against the absurd. The universe may remain indifferent to human existence, but human beings continue speaking to one another through creation. Each work of art whispers the same message across time. You are not alone in this struggle. In this sense, art becomes more than personal expression. It becomes a form of human resistance against isolation. The artist transforms private experience into something shared. He takes the confusion of existence and gives it a voice that others can recognize. The absurd individual, therefore, does not withdraw from the world. He participates in it through creation. This participation can take many forms. Art, in the traditional sense, is only one example. Writing, music, painting, theater. But creation also appears in everyday life. A teacher shaping the minds of students. A builder constructing spaces where people can live. A thinker developing ideas that challenge the habits of society. Each act of creation affirms that human beings remain active participants in their own existence. The absurd does not silence them, it provokes them. Camus believed that this creative impulse represents one of the most powerful responses to the emptiness of the universe. Instead of waiting for meaning to appear, human beings begin producing meaning through their actions. Life becomes an ongoing work of creation. The rebel who understands the absurd lives not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. He shapes his experiences, his relationships, and his contributions to the world. He creates not because creation guarantees immortality. He creates because the act itself affirms life. This attitude dissolves the illusion that meaning must be permanent in order to matter. A painting may fade, a book may be forgotten, a song may disappear from memory. But the act of creation still carries value because it represents a moment when human consciousness confronted the absurd and answered with expression. The meaning lies in the act itself. Camus believed that societies often forget this truth. They measure art by its fame, its market value, or its cultural prestige. They turn creativity into competition rather than affirmation. But from the perspective of the absurd, creation does not need external validation. Its value lies in the courage to express life within a silent universe. Every act of creation becomes a quiet refusal to accept meaninglessness as the final word. And yet, even this creative rebellion reveals something deeper. Art connects individuals. Solidarity connects communities. Rebellion connects human beings to their own dignity. All these responses share the same origin. A human being standing before the silence of the universe and refusing to surrender. But the journey does not end with rebellion, freedom, solidarity, or creation alone. All these elements point toward a final realization that Camus believed defined the true legacy of his philosophy. A realization that forces the human being to face the most difficult question of all. If life has no predetermined meaning, and if human dignity emerges from the way we choose to live within that truth, then the ultimate challenge remains brutally simple. How should a human being live when he finally understands the full weight of the absurd? Confronting the absurd does not destroy life. It exposes its true weight. Albert Camus forces humanity to face a truth most philosophies attempt to soften. The universe offers no predetermined meaning. It provides no cosmic explanation for suffering, no divine script that guarantees justice, no final promise that human existence serves a hidden purpose. The silence of the world remains intact. Yet, Camus refuses to treat this silence as a defeat. Instead, he transforms it into the starting point of a new dignity. The absurd is not the end of meaning, it is the end of illusion. Once the human being recognizes this condition, three possibilities emerge. He can escape through despair, he can escape through comforting belief, or he can remain fully conscious within the tension between human longing and cosmic silence. Camus chooses the third path. He demands that we live without appeal, without metaphysical comfort, without surrender. This demand appears harsh, yet it reveals something powerful. When illusions collapse, freedom begins. A person who no longer expects the universe to justify existence becomes responsible for creating value through action. Meaning is no longer discovered in distant heavens or inevitable historical destiny. It is built through rebellion, solidarity, creativity, and conscious living. The rebel, therefore, becomes the central figure of Camus' philosophy. The rebel refuses humiliation. He refuses injustice. But he also refuses the temptation to become a tyrant in the name of justice. He understands that rebellion must remain human. It must respect limits. It must defend dignity without claiming absolute truth. This is where Camus separates authentic rebellion from fanaticism. Fanatics promise perfect futures. Rebels defend fragile lives in the present. Fanatics destroy in the name of ideals. Rebels resist destruction in the name of human dignity. The absurd, therefore, produces a new ethical vision, not one based on divine command or metaphysical certainty, but one rooted in shared human vulnerability. Every person lives beneath the same silent universe. Every life carries the same fragile value. From this recognition, solidarity emerges. We rebel not only for ourselves, but for others who share the same condition. The cry against injustice becomes a declaration of shared humanity. A person who says no to humiliation is already defending the dignity of all. Creation then becomes the final gesture of rebellion. When the universe refuses to give meaning, the human being answers through art, thought, and action. Creation does not solve the absurd. It confronts it. Each work of art, each act of courage, each expression of freedom becomes a quiet defiance against the emptiness surrounding human existence. Camus believed this response defines the true strength of the human spirit: to live without illusion, to accept the limits of existence without surrendering to despair, to create meaning within a world that refuses to provide it. The dignity of humanity does not lie in discovering cosmic purpose. It lies in the courage to live consciously despite the absence of such purpose. And this courage leads to a final realization that Camus leaves echoing through his philosophy. The universe may remain silent, but the way a human being chooses to live within that silence will always remain his answer.